Well, good morning, and apologies for a briefly delayed start. I was just saying to Oliver, it's always nice to get a little jolt of anxiety first thing in the morning when you're worried about technical difficulties. But welcome to our JGP guests. I'm Jeff Postian, and we are fortunate today to spend some time with Mr. Oliver Burkeman. As was mentioned in our invitation for the event, at the beginning of each year, I select 12 books to read in the year ahead. And in 2022, 4,000 Weeks was one of those books, and needless to say, I loved it. In fact, so much we wanted to share it with all of you. We think it's a message that is really relatable to our mission, which is helping clients live the life that they want. And also maybe there's just some general pearls of wisdom that Oliver has come across that I think are just great things to share with one another. In addition to 4,000 Weeks, Oliver is the author of The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking, and How to Become Slightly Happier and Get a Bit More Done. He wrote a long-running weekly column on psychology for The Guardian called This Column Will Change Your Life. And in addition, his work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Psychologist, and New Philosopher. Oliver currently resides in York, England, which is where he is joining from today. And please welcome our guest, Oliver Burkeman.
Thanks so much, Jeff. It's a huge pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to this. They always say at the beginning of they tell me that at the beginning of talks like this, you're supposed to make a promise to the audience about why it's worth their engaging for the time it's going to take. My problem is that the promise that I want to make is to do my very best to lead as many of you as possible to the brink of a kind of massive existential crisis about how short life is. I do think it's a really important and uplifting, ultimately, crisis to go through. But I have been accused of being downbeat, I suppose, in my message because we are here for such a tiny amount of time when you actually think about it. The British philosopher Brian McGee had this wonderful thought experiment. He pointed out that today in the world a lot of people will be turning 100. So if we find one of those people and go back to the day that they were born, the day if they first were born, somebody that day turned 100. You could take that person and go back another 100 years, find somebody who on the day that that person was born turned 100, and so on and so on and so on. So you can envisage this kind of chain of end-to-end 100-year lifespans going back through history. Well, if that's how you measure time, the golden age of the Egyptian pharaohs, right? A time that seems impossibly distant to so many of us, to all of us really, was 35 lifetimes ago. 20 lifetimes ago takes you back to the time of Christ. 5 lifetimes ago, Henry VIII was on the throne of England. And Brian McGee liked to say that the number of lifetimes you would need to span the entirety of human civilization, 6,000 years since the ancient Sumerians of Mesopotamia, is about 60. It's the number of people that he could squeeze into his apartment for a cocktail party. So seen this way, everything we do here is over so quickly. It's been so brief. And of course, then an individual human life, an average of 4,000 weeks, which I used as the title for my book because I was basically so horrified by it and wanted everyone else to share my panic attack, is the merest flicker of consciousness. When I first made that mental calculation, I asked a friend of mine to guess how many weeks she thought the average human could expect to live. And she's very, very smart, but she's not a mathematician. And she just guessed the number 150,000. And I love this mistake because if you double that number, 300,000, you get the duration in weeks of the whole of human civilized society going back to Mesopotamia. It's absolutely mind-boggling. And so naturally, yes, it behoves us to use it very well. The problem is that what happens when we try to use it well is that it seems to make matters worse. I have a long personal experience of this as a member of that group of people called productivity geeks, people who are kind of obsessed with finding the exact right combination of time management systems, of task management approaches, the Pomodoro technique, the Eisenhower matrix, time boxing, all the rest of it goes on forever, in the hopes of finding this fantastic, perfect silver bullet that's going to make it feel like we're getting done all the things that we need to get done. And I can testify from personal experience what people discover when they do this, which is that it really just makes things worse. You get busier. If you get really, really good, for example, at answering email at a rapid tempo, you find that your reward is to receive much, much, much more email, because you reply to people and they reply to your replies, and you have to reply to those replies, and on and on and on it goes until the death of the universe. And so there is no real reward for attempting to get on top of our time in this way. It actually makes things worse. It's not only as well that we have such a limited quantity of time, and I promise you this is all going to reach an uplifting conclusion, but it's not just that we have a limited quantity of time, but that we have incredibly limited control over our time. We talk about having time. You may feel that you have a certain number of weeks or years left, certain number of hours in which to complete a specific project, but we never possess time in the sense that that implies, right? We always just sort of get one moment after another after another. Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher who is extremely difficult to understand, as I can testify, and it's not his only fault. Membership of the Nazi Party was arguably a much worse one. But he uses this word, Geworfenheit, which gets translated into English as thrownness, to refer to the way in which we just find ourselves here in this moment, with all our past behind us, whether we like it or not, and with no real control over the future. It doesn't mean that planning and setting goals isn't a valid thing to be doing. I really think it is, but it is not an activity that actually causes us to exert any control over the future. When we say we have a number of hours or a number of weeks to do something, we mean that we expect it. I thought I had, over the last week, for example, 6 days to focus on my work, and then a news event happened here in the UK that you might just conceivably have read about or seen on television or in the newspapers, and they called a sudden school holiday to mark the funeral, and everything is immediately up in the air. So that kind of limit to our control over time is in some ways just as troubling to us as our feeling that there's too much to do with our time. I thought it would be useful today to put this in the context of success, to put it in the context of people who are not necessarily scrambling to work 3 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads, but to note this very strange and perverse situation that even if you do well in life, even if you get the things you set out to get, the feeling of overwhelm doesn't really go away. The feeling of needing to move fast is very difficult to let go of. As Jeff said when we were planning this conversation, it's hard to take the backpack off, perhaps especially in American society, once you've got into that driven mode. There's a social theorist called Hartmut Rosa who talks about this kind of sense of existential overwhelm that we have, right? You could have nothing on your to-do list that is unpleasant to you. You could be in retirement and simply trying to make it through a long bucket list of wonderful vacations you want to take and fantastic new hobbies you want to take up. But even that situation is one that is subject to this sense of having more that you want to do or feel that you need to do than you actually can do. And it's because of this simple fact that as humans, we have extremely finite capacities, but we swim in this world of infinite inputs. There's always more that we could do. And the technology that we live with, of course, is endlessly bringing us far more of that than we otherwise might have had. And so the effect of this is that fulfillment is persistently postponed into the future. There's always this sense that the real time of your life is coming, but it's not quite there yet. That the value of what you're doing is in order to get to the end of some list or to get to some point where you have all the elements of your life in place. John Maynard Keynes, the economist, had this wonderful line in a speech where he talks about the purposive man, the person who's always trying to make the best use of his time, and saying that this person doesn't really love his cat, but only the cat's kittens, nor in truth the kittens, but only really the kitten's kittens, and so on forward to the end of catdom, as he put it. So there's this sense that like the future is always where meaning is going to reside. It's something that you can sort of get away with in your teens and your early 20s, perhaps. But of course, as we get further through life, we get more of the things that we set out to achieve. It gets harder and harder to maintain this sense that, you know, real life is going to begin at some point in the future, that fulfillment is coming. I think what drives all of this pure perverse sort of neurotic way in which we end up thinking about time, this sort of very unfulfilling way in which we end up living our lives with respect to time, is ultimately this deep discomfort with the fact that we are so finite, that we have so little time and so little control over that time. Because for as long as you're saying that the real stuff is still going to come in the future, as long as you're saying that at some point you're going to get everything in order, or your life under control, or your email box permanently at zero multiple times a day, you know, as long as that's all still in the future, you still don't have to quite fully face the kind of existential truth of being a finite human, which is that you're going to miss out on almost everything that life has to offer. You're going to fail to do almost all the things you could hypothetically have done. And you're never going to be able to be certain about what's coming next in the future. But the message that I think is ultimately liberating here is that this situation is actually a lot worse than you think. And that's really good news. Because it's not that it's really, really hard to do all the things you want to do. It's that it's completely impossible. It's that it's baked into the human condition. People talk about the fear of missing out as if it might be possible to avoid missing out, when in fact it's inevitable that you're going to miss out on almost everything. And here, I promise the upbeat part, here is why I think this is such a liberating message. It's because then you can give yourself permission to not do certain things, to neglect certain things, in order to pour your time, your attention, your energy, those all too finite resources, into a handful of things that truly count. Because once you really see that you're going to leave almost every experience that the world has to offer on the table, not through your own fault, but just because it's baked into being human, that is a burden lifted. That is the moment at which you can really and truly come to the present and find value in the present. I'm just keeping an eye on my time here. You know, I think one way of illustrating the point I'm trying to make here is this incredibly annoying story from the time management literature that I'm sure some people here have encountered, about the rocks in the jar. The idea here is that the setting is like a college classroom or something, and the professor brings into the classroom a large glass jar, a whole bunch of big rocks, some pebbles and some sand, and he challenges the students to find a way to fit it all in. And these students, who are apparently not very clever, start putting the sand in first and the pebbles in first, and then they find there isn't enough room for the big rocks. So then the college professor, perhaps rather smugly, sets out the truth of the matter, which is that you need to put the big rocks in first, and then all the little stuff fits around it. But as I say in the book, this is a rigged demonstration. This is a scam. The professor has only brought as many big rocks to the classroom that he knows are going to fit inside that jar. So the fact that there's a way of making them all fit is kind of a given. The problem that we have today, the problem that actually gets worse as you get more successful with respect to time, is that there are just too many big rocks. There are too many things that you could do with your time that would be legitimate uses of that time. And so the only way to really show up for life and to really find fulfillment in things that you do is to be willing to let some of those big rocks never make it anywhere near that jar. And I think if you can sort of let this viewpoint seep into your pores, it sort of gets under your skin, you can actually come to appreciate what I write about in the book as the joy of missing out, JOMO, the sense that when you choose to do something, to go on vacation to one place instead of all the others, to stay home in order to spend time with your spouse or your kids or whoever, rather than take advantage of some of the other opportunities that might have been around for entertainment or socialization that night, it adds more meaning to the choice you make to have that kind of vivid, bittersweet awareness of the sacrifices that you're making. So, my remaining time talking tonight, I wanted to try to set out some practical some sort of actionable ways of embodying this kind of approach to our finitude that confronts it, that doesn't spend life trying to avoid it and not feel it, and explain why that can be so rewarding. I think one that has made a really big difference to me is the idea of giving up clearing the decks. I think in life, especially at work, in our professional lives, but in life as a whole, many people fall into this idea that they've got to sort of deal with all the little stuff that's tugging at their attention before they get round to the really important things, to clear away space for and focus for the things that really matter by answering the emails, by finishing all the paperwork. But of course, what happens, as I've already discussed and as many people have discovered, is that the decks are never clear. The decks fill up constantly. There is an infinite supply of articles you maybe ought to read, or people you maybe ought to reach out to, or demands that are being made, and on it goes. So actually, the real skill here is not getting through all of that stuff, becoming so efficient that you could handle an infinite supply, which is not something that is open to us as human beings, but rather learning to tolerate the anxiety of knowing that the decks are not clear, that there are lots of other little things tugging your attention, and nonetheless spending a bit of time, a couple of hours a day, first hour of the morning, this week, or however you think about this, spending a bit of time now focusing on what really matters the most to you. Anyone who's had any level of financial success understands the ancient cliched wisdom of paying yourself first, of putting money into savings or investments prior to spending it on the things you need to spend it on just to get through the month. We need to do the same with time. We need to pay ourselves first with time, and understand that if we wait for time to be left over at the end of doing all the other things, it's not going to be there. I think another thing that's really important is to harness the power of patience. One of the ways in which we try incredibly hard to exert control over the speed at which we think time should go, the speed at which we think our lives should unfold, is we just get incredibly impatient. And it's something that has grown much worse in the presence of all these time-saving technologies we have today: microwaves, dishwashers, jet planes. These things should make us feel more relaxed about time because they free up the hours. But of course, it doesn't happen. What happens instead is that everyone gets more and more impatient. When I was reporting this book, I did an exercise at the instruction of an art historian at Harvard University, where I went to look at a single painting in the Harvard Art Museums for 3 hours straight, mainly just to go through that deep discomfort of not being able to dictate the speed at which my activities unfolded. It's extraordinary to think that sitting in front of a beautiful painting for 3 hours should be painful, but that's kind of what it felt like. Why put yourself through this? Well, I think the answer is that on the other side of that discomfort, there is almost always greater fulfillment, creative new insights that you wouldn't otherwise have had. In the context of art appreciation, you literally see things in the painting that you, or I anyway, would not have seen if I'd done what I usually do in art galleries, which is spend a couple of minutes looking at a painting and then tell myself that I've seen it. I think this importance of recovering patience applies to reading, especially. I think we've become a culture that finds it really hard to slow down to the speed that reading requires. And I think it crops up too, just in listening to people, just in having a deep and fulfilling relationship with your spouse, with your adult children, your small children. it's not always comfortable. In fact, it's maybe never comfortable to really, really stop to the degree that is required to listen, to hear somebody in that respect. And I think if we can think in this way, we can actually let it sink in to our souls, what it really means to be finite, and not go around in despair or nihilism or give up trying to do things, but the exact opposite. We can be energized to see that actually we don't need to try to do it all. That would not be possible. And that is why we should get started or keep going with the things that really matter. The author and podcaster Sam Harris has this wonderful but terrifying point that he makes, that our lives are full of experiences that we're having for the last time, but we don't know that it's the last time that we're having them. The example he gives is that there's a last time he will pick up his daughters. And as the parent of a small child, this appalls me. I can't imagine ever not picking up my young son. And yet I'm obliged to note that my mid-70s father doesn't pick me up when we meet. I'm basically quite glad about that. So clearly this is happening all the time. There are wonderful, important experiences that are coming and going. And in a sense, every moment is like that, whether it's a significant one or not. We get it, it's there, and then it goes. And I hope that it's possible to see what I have found as a result of going on the journey that led to this book, which is that this actually is an insight that makes life much more precious, much more poignant, sad in a way, because wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to do everything, but actually incredibly motivating when it comes to doing the things that we know really count. So if you wanted like one piece of just completely concrete, actionable advice from what I'm saying here, I think there'll be more when I talk with Jeff in just a moment, but it would just be to make sure that today or tomorrow, if you're booked up for the rest of the day, you spend some time, maybe it's just 20 minutes, but some time doing one of those things that you have been postponing and postponing and postponing for what seemed like really good reasons. Maybe because other people make demands of you, maybe because it seems like it would be dutiful and sensible to do all those other things first, but nonetheless, to actually give yourself a little bit of time right away on what matters, because if we are going to use our lives meaningfully, at some point, we're going to have to do that right now in this moment. So I really hope that you can see not only the sort of panic-inducing existential crisis part of this, but also the sort of liberation of it, the degree to which it can be a weight off our shoulders when it comes to time. In the book, I quote an American Zen Buddhist, Charlotte Jocko Beck, who says about life, "What makes it unbearable is your mistaken belief that it can be cured." There isn't a solution to our being finite. But if we can really, really internalize the fact that there is no solution, that can actually be the portal to a wonderfully meaningful life. Thank you. Thanks very much for listening.
Well, thank you, and I hope you can hear me okay. As I'm sitting in my house on Savi Island, my landscapers just arrived, and of course the guy's blowing right outside my window right now. First of all, if you have questions that you would like me to try and ask Oliver, you can put them into the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen, and I'll do my best to get some questions answered for you. I also have teed up some questions for Oliver, and it's kind of funny because we didn't necessarily choreograph what he was going to say or what my questions were going to be. I love the book. I've read it twice. I had my own questions, and then as I was listening to Oliver this morning, I was finding that much of what he was covering already was going to be answered by my question. So Oliver, I guess one thing that's on my mind is you asked a question in the book, which was, what would it mean to spend the only time you ever get in a way that truly feels as though you're making it count? And some of us, we read a question like that and it feels really big, maybe like feeling let down, like it's too late, or we miss that moment. And I also loved how you've talked about and wrote about finding joy and meaning in our everyday activities. How do we shift our thinking from that big lens to just finding joy and meaning each day?
That's the I was going to say it's a really good question. It's kind of the only question, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with a big lens. Uh, it's useful in certain ways, but when it comes down to it, where the rubber hits the road for a meaningful life is always in moments. I think people are led astray by the idea that there is a single purpose, that there was a single thing they came here to do, that because there's still a lot that they want to do and haven't done, that means that what they have done in the past is somehow a cause for regret. There's a certain kind of regret that is healthy, right? I mean, yes, all the things we've done up to now, we could have done lots of other things, and we chose to do those things, and something we've had to wave goodbye to a lot of possibilities. But I think the wonderful news really here is that meaning can be located in almost anything, right? It doesn't, there's nothing, there's no reason to fall into this notion that says only the truly extraordinary things or the things that make everybody else gasp or the things that record your name in the history books are necessarily what count as living a meaningful life. And we kind of all know this, right? We all have experiences of going on a hike or being present at the birth or the early life of a newborn baby, or maybe a meditation retreat. There are all sorts of different experiences where we're doing something that is absolutely normal. It's just what people have done for millennia, and yet we know that it really is something that matters. I'll just say quickly, if people are struggling to answer the question of whether what they're doing currently is meaningful or not, I write in the book, and I really appreciate this question from the Jungian psychotherapist James Hollis, who says that we should ask, is this path enlarging me or diminishing me? It's a slightly sort of new agey way of talking, but what it does is it cuts through this question of like, is this making me happy? Is it the best thing I could be doing with my time? There are a million reasons why these are just disastrous questions to ask yourself, but am I sort of continuing to grow as a person? Is the question that for most people there's sort of an intuitive ability to answer. And if the answer to that is yes, then I don't think there's anything to worry about. If the answer is no, then it's a wonderful opportunity to ask what it would mean to make the answer be yes.
Thank you. Um, Hypothetical question for you. Imagine for a moment you're a professional, an executive, a business owner, and you've had a really hard charging career where you've trained yourself and adapted to this insanely busy schedule, a never ending to do list, constant digital interruptions. You've been overcommitted, maybe had poor work life balance, and then suddenly, boom, one day you find yourself retired. And maybe the retirement was your choice, maybe it was somebody else's. Knowing everything you've uncovered and learned in your work, what are a few things that you would turn to in order to adjust and find center in this new reality?
Another great question, and it's only hypothetical for me insofar as that I'm, not retired, but all the rest about being overcommitted and driven and all the rest of it is something that I've certainly both benefited from and suffered from, I think, for much of my life. I think the number one thing I want to say about that is there is a really important role here for expectations, which is another way of saying, when you stop and you slow down and you attempt to read a novel, you attempt to return to a hobby that you used to find deeply fulfilling, you attempt to go somewhere on vacation where the only goal is to relax, just don't expect it to feel absolutely wonderful at first. There's this very strong cultural reinforcement that says, because you've been in some sense working up to this moment, therefore when the moment comes it should be ecstasy, and that's just not going to be how it goes. Because we're so sort of conditioned to be how we are. So I would encourage people to experiment with sort of riding out discomfort a little bit, because it always turns out in my experience that the discomfort is really extremely tolerable, and it might be a day into a different speed of life or a different kind of life that you start to realize that there are enjoyable things about it, and maybe in a week deeply enjoyable things about it. But for that first day the flywheel is just turning too fast. So I think it's important to see that. In terms of um, how to go about making that transition in other ways, I think with anything, transitions like this, I apply this logic to my own creative work, and a very important strategy time and time again is what I call radical incrementalism, right? It's being willing to do the thing for 5 minutes or 1 hour. It depends on what the thing is, obviously. But you know, if if it's a challenge for somebody to stop at all, then maybe stopping for 20 minutes in the course of a day is a huge triumphant achievement. And there's no reason to sort of make things incredibly hard for yourself by planning to go from absolute full speed to zero or something. And I think what people find in that situation is that it it's not a state of less engagement, right? It doesn't need to be a state of less engagement. No longer working at the pace that you used to work can be the opportunity to go much deeper into the ideas that you care about, to engage much more wholeheartedly with activities that make you feel alive, right? It doesn't have to be, it's not vegging out. It can be the exact opposite. You can maybe come to see that at certain times in your incredibly busy career, maybe the busyness was serving as a kind of a distraction. But rest and going at the speed of life, that doesn't have to be a distraction.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one thing that you had written about also, which kind of relates to what you just said, is about practicing doing nothing. And I was thinking, we live in this time where there's such a focus on efficiency and productivity and being busy. Um, this idea of doing nothing, I think it's interesting. I'm curious, how if you have some tips maybe to help us reconcile that doing nothing.
I mean, this is literally a practice. Like if you're the kind of person who enjoys training at a sport, enjoys training, strength training, cardio training, try doing nothing training. And if you need to approach things in your life like you're developing a skill and you're going, hard at them, then do that. Do it with this. I mean, it's amazing. There are studies that have been done, right, where they left people alone in a room, nothing to do. The only thing that was in the room was a machine they could use to self-deliver painful electric shocks. And a huge proportion of people, and interestingly, a lot more of the men than the women, choose to do that rather than sit and do nothing. Now, I'm not bringing this up because I think that what you ought to do with your life or your years of retirement or anything like that is nothing, but just literally to see if you can spend 10 minutes in a room doing nothing. Well, you will fail. You'll start thinking about things, which is doing something. That's fine. No harm, no foul. But then you endeavor to sort of give that up. You'll probably get up and start fidgeting again. Doesn't matter. But once you notice you're doing it, go back to the basic state of doing nothing. It's a muscle that can be trained. And what's rewarding about it is that it doesn't take a lot of training of it to really start to benefit from it in all the other times of the day when you're not doing nothing.
Well, I appreciate that. I think if it's a muscle, I'm in big trouble. Um, one question you mentioned creativity a moment ago, and there's a question from the audience with regard to creativity, and I'm going to paraphrase it. They were saying that a friend of theirs had done some work on time, and he calls it the alchemy of wasted time, with the premise being that creativity is the residue of wasted time. Now, she was asking what your thoughts are on the benefits of this idea.
It's super interesting. One of the perspectives that I explore in the book that I think connects to this is the idea that we've become so instrumental as a culture, as a society, in our use of time that we don't really want to accept the validity of anything unless it's got some future benefit. So you see articles and books about how the reason you should rest is basically that it'll make you more productive. Well, I think that's true. But also, like, maybe you should just rest because it's like nice to rest, and it could be nice to rest. Um, and so we have a very fraught relationship with wasting time. In some sense, we need to waste time because we've come to define anything sort of restful or non-purposive as a waste. Well, if everything non-purposive is wasteful, then yeah, we should waste some time because it's very important to have that element of things in your life that you're doing just for themselves, not to get somewhere, not even to develop a skill, just because you take pleasure in the doing of them. And I think a byproduct of that, absolutely, even though I'm talking about not doing it for other reasons, a byproduct of that is absolutely a lot of the benefits that come from creativity, no matter how that expresses itself in your life. This is the cliche that one gets all one's best ideas in the shower, right? It's because that is a place, or one of the reasons is because that is a place where you're not trying to have ideas. You're not trying to dominate the unconscious with the conscious ego, frontal cortex, however you want to think about it. You're not trying to sort of force ideas out of yourself. You're just letting them rise up. So yeah, one way in which I try to harness this as a writer is I'm never without my little notebook for recording things in, because they're probably going to come at times when I'm not actually focused on my creative work.
Yeah, yeah. I could talk to you, as I told you originally, for so long. I don't want to, you know, uh, overdo my time. There's a couple of really good questions from the audience. One was, give some tips on how you and your partner approach 4,000 weeks together.
Well, one way in which me and my partner approach 4,000 Weeks Together is that she is constantly reminding me that I need to read my own book. She thinks this is very funny, and I think it is kind of funny, but she's also right. I mean, so one of the things here is to understand that I think that using time meaningfully and well, and really showing up for other people in your life, it is just going to be a constant matter of being a work in progress. It's going to be a matter of falling off the wagon and getting back onto the wagon. I think that the crucial thing with other people of any kind, whether they are a spouse or not, is that so much of the benefit of time, so much of the meaning that we derive from how we use our time, comes collectively. It comes from synchronizing our time with other people's time, because you can have all the time in the world, if none of your friends or the people closest to you are available to be with you in that time, or teammates in a work operation, it's useless, right? It's like there's nothing luxurious about having lots of time if the things you want to do require other people who aren't there. So I mean, I guess one very obvious thing I've never really talked about, but it springs to mind, it is sort of manifestation of this, is that we have my wife and I have a specific hour in the weekly schedule set aside for a sort of catch-up conversation about stuff, relationship stuff. It's not the only time we have those conversations. It's not like we don't talk to each other for the other 167 hours of the week, but there is that sense of like, this is an inviolable hour, and the rest of life has to fit around it, because I have plenty of time for that kind of conversation, and she has plenty of time for that kind of conversation, even though we're both busy people. The problem and the thing you need to give attention to is making sure that occasionally it's the same bit of time. And then, of course, parenting with a respect to the messages in the book is a whole other challenge. I think I've made big strides. I do think my book is a little bit wiser than I am, if that makes sense, but I'm constantly working towards it.
I appreciate that. Kind of related. So as I'm listening to you, and I'm really going back and identifying some of the concepts that that resonated with me, and I think one of them is how we weight and value the options of the things that we have to do today. So, on Sundays, I always find myself drawn to the grand experience of the day, the big hike, the big, the paddle board, whatever it might be, like that one thing that was like you could talk about grandly at the office all week long, versus maybe just the joy I find in making Sunday dinner. But I think that we don't always sort of reconcile out and wait those smaller things that give us joy. That kind of goes into this question that was posed, which is, being in the ninth inning of my life, I find myself beginning to assess about that last day. What might be some strategies to feel fulfilled until the end?
It's a lovely question. I don't think I'll try to continue the baseball analogy, because I will mess it up. I think that the most that any of us can demand of ourselves is that we showed up for as much of our lives as we were able, um, that we were really present and not trying to avoid the highs, or the lows, as well as showing up for the highs. Um, in terms of doing that towards a later stage in life, I would just want to really, really champion the power of your intuition, your hunches. It depends who you are. I realize this, but many people spend their lives getting a lot of success from a rational approach to things, from making plans and from reaping wealth and doing well in that way. I think in the later stages of life, that's maybe a time to listen especially hard to the sort of uh, urgings that you don't really know where they come from, that tell you certain things are important. Spending time with certain people is important. Exploring certain uh, activities, spiritual practices, religious traditions for a lot of people at that stage in life, returning to things like that came from early life. I didn't want to write a book that was like, here's the list of things you should do, and I'm not going to give it in response to this answer, but I think that is a time to really listen to the less uh, rational and conscious, logical side of one's being, probably.
Great. Do you have time for two more quick questions?
I have time. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. This question was, how do differing cultural societal norms contribute to this perspective?
Yeah, this is such a huge question. I basically deliberately didn't go there in my book, because I would have written like another 8,000 page book about how people conceive of time uh, in different cultures and subcultures within individual countries and things like that. Um, I do look a bit at a historical um, change in how we've come to see time, and I think that actually feeds rather directly into the cultural things. It has a lot to do with the impact of industrialization and then the technological revolution, the degree to which people invest in the idea of time as an objective resource that they have to get the most value out of. That's something that is extremely intense in American culture and barely less intense in British culture, and tends to be less intense in places that are sort of less fast moving, perhaps less sort of economically cutthroat in certain ways, um, and certainly in less developed countries. And I think that what that has to do with, I mean, partly it's kind of the consequence of a negative thing, right? It's partly you get this interesting consequence that when people's hopes for their life circumstances are not much, when they have less thought that they might be able to hit the big time or utterly transform their life circumstances, it naturally takes their focus back into the present, into finding joy and fulfillment, like right here, right now, in the middle of the mess, instead of investing faith in this idea that you can get to a place where there is no mess. So I think our challenge, I'm speaking broadly because I don't know exactly who's watching, of course, but our challenge as people who live in cultures where we do have an extraordinary amount of opportunity, where there is the possibility, at least for some people, of great social mobility, of sort of realizing things that as a kid you might never have dreamed you would be able to have. The big challenge is to pursue that in the sort of a spirit of play, but not make the meaning of life dependent on them, not postpone uh, the full value of being alive until you have those things. It's a hard thing to pull off, but I think that's what we need to try to do.
That's really good. Thank you. Okay, one more question for you. What would be your advice to someone who is financially successful, who considers themselves to be living a full life, who doesn't necessarily need a total reboot in how they use their time, but who still feels that nagging sense that they could be using their remaining years in a more meaningful way? And I know you've hit on this a little bit, but is there anything else that sort of resonates with you when you think about that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just really important to not feel bad about the fact, I suppose, that success does not eliminate this nagging sense, right? It's not that you did something wrong to get to where you are. It's that there is a sort of ultimate final sliver of fulfillment that can only come from within, can only come from value being found in the present, and that's true for all of us. It's true even if you sort of checked off every item you could have thought of on the list of accomplishments or the list of successes. I think that the point I mentioned about whether you're on an enlarging path or a diminishing path, whether you're doing something that sort of causes your soul to grow, to speak metaphorically, is an important one. I think also it's very important to remember that you're going to that the pain of making sacrifices, right? The fact that you have to not do certain things in order to do others of them, that's going to feel a lot worse for somebody in that successful position, for the simple reason that the things they're choosing between are more value to them. So, to give a sort of crass example, there is some research, I think, showing that the wealthier you get, the more challenging it is to enjoy your vacation time, because the opportunity cost feels more intense. The number of things you're turning down, right? If all you can do is go on a camping vacation because that's all your resources allow, then you don't worry about whether you ought to have booked a skiing trip to, you know, Switzerland instead of the safari that you went on in sub-Saharan Africa. You don't have those options. They don't torment you. If you do have those options, you're actually having to sort of be more muscular in your willingness to allow yourself to miss out on things um, than you otherwise might, because those are options for you. And yet, of course, doing all of them, getting through all of it, is just as off the table for you as it is for any other human on the planet.
As I have heard and sometimes witnessed, people on vacation planning their next vacation.
Right, right. I hear that on cruise ships, there's usually a place where you can spend a big chunk of your cruise booking your next cruise. So
Yeah,
yeah.
something to avoid. Oliver, I can't tell you how much I enjoyed this time with you. I love your book and your ideas, and I just really want to say thank you and express gratitude for what you're putting out there to all of us. It's really helpful and making an impact in the world. So thank you so much, and thanks for taking some time with us today.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate those kind words, and it's been a pleasure. I love talking about all this stuff, and I hope that people listening and watching realize the way in which it is sort of liberating as well as terrifying in a certain way. Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you again. Cheers.
Thanks.